discussion. So a huge welcome to you all for joining. This is a part of a series of 3 webinars, and I think we can get into the chat box a link so that you can all have information on the other 2 which are coming up next week. I understand if you've registered for this one, you passed the first test, but you will need to register for the other 2 webinars separately. So please do make sure you go on and register for the second and the third webinar in the series over the course of the coming days into next week. And all 3 of these webinars are part of an information and discussion series on aspects of DSI in the run-up to COP16, and particularly important as you move through into the negotiations at COP16 to decide on the modalities for operationalizing the multilateral mechanism that was agreed to be set up at COP15. And during the discussions to date on DSI, many references for the multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of DSI have called for the mechanism to be future-proof. And this is particularly important given the fast pace of technological advances in the field, but probably also to avoid the need to renegotiate the mechanism too frequently through COPs. So in support of your discussion on future-proofing, UNEP-WCMC, in collaboration with the CBD Secretariat, has produced a draft scoping study on potential future commercial use of DSI, and it's that which is being presented today in this webinar. And I hope through accessing the webinar registration, you've also had access to the document and therefore had a chance to take a look through some of the document, but we're going to present on some of the details of it today. So we'll present the preliminary insights of the scoping study, some considerations on possible implications for the ongoing discussions, and then we'll open up for reflections, technical views, feedback on its content. And we can take any questions at that stage on the work that's been done, but mainly we'll seek to gather further views on how the development of technologies that use DSI will change in the coming years. Very keen to augment the findings of the scoping study with your perspectives, your views, and including on any additional considerations that may be needed to operationalize the multilateral mechanism in light of the insight we have from the scoping study and your views today. So that's the plan for the next hour and a half. We'll hear shortly from the CBD Secretariat and some housekeeping comments for this session, but let's start our session today with some introductory remarks from the esteemed co-chairs of the ad hoc open-ended working group on benefit sharing from the use of DSI, Mfatso Kalemba and/or Will Lockhart. And I'm not sure who's going to talk at the opening session, and maybe another one's talking at the end. But let me pass across to our co-chairs, Will and Mfatso. Over to you.
Good time of the day, everybody. Thank you very much indeed, Neville. It's wonderful to be here. I think I'm talking first, and my dear co-chair Mfatso will speak to you at the end. I'm joining you from London, unsurprisingly, but a different part of London. I'm at the London School of Economics today, attending a fantastic 2-day workshop on digital sequence information. We are hearing from the experts at LSE about all sorts of economic considerations that we've been talking about through our work to date. And I think that's just another piece in the puzzle that Neville has just described to us all, the huge amount of work that is going on internationally, really being led by all of you. I want to say thank you, everybody, for your hard work so far. I saw some of you last week as well in Pretoria. The pace is quickening, but the work is brilliant and the commitment is brilliant. So huge thanks. I'm looking forward to today's presentation. I know Mfatso is as well. I won't say any more other than that I'm tremendously looking forward to seeing you all in 3 short weeks in Cali, and I'm sure that the discussion today will be a really important preparation for that. Thank you so much. I'll see you all soon.
Thank you, Will, and I believe with that we'll go straight on to Charlotte or Kirsty for a few comments on today's webinar and how it's going to be run.
Thank you, Neville, and hello also from London at LSE, where we're talking about DSI in other contexts as well. So a little bit of housekeeping for this webinar. Welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to have you. The DSI team is fully aware that we're asking a lot of your attention these days, so we appreciate when you make time for us. So in terms of reporting, you have to be aware that this webinar is being recorded because not everybody can attend. So it will be made available on our website, and You have the address on the slide. The language will be in English only. So that's yeah, that's just the way it has to be at the moment. There will be a Q&A session. So during the webinar, everybody is muted. You cannot jump in and ask a question. However, you are able to use the chat function to start putting questions in. We ask you not to use the chat to have a parallel discussion or, really lengthy interventions on this topic or any similar topic. We really want to keep the discussion for after the presentation. So please be mindful of that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the opening remarks are now almost done. And then the team from WCMC will present the key finding of the scoping study that they did. The presentation is on purpose not very long. Hopefully you have had a time to actually look at the draft of the study, but they'll give you the key outcomes and of their work. There will be plenty of time for question and answers and discussion on this topic. This is really the main goal here, is to have your input on this work and on this topic. And then we'll finish on time with closing remarks by the co-chairs. That, Neville, back to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Charlotte. And yes, if we can put in the chat box both the link to the
You're muted, Neville.
The should be okay.
Yes,
can you hear me now?
Here. Yeah.
Okay. So if you can put in the chat box, Kirsty or Charlotte, the link has just been requested to the thank you, to the webinar series that's going on, including in the first one, this webinar, you'll find the link to the document itself. So that's the link you can find to download the document itself. Let's move on. Then we're going to present the findings to you now. Let's move on to a presentation of the key findings. And so let me introduce you to colleagues who will now present the draft scoping report to you. We're going to hear from two colleagues. Firstly, Amy Rankin, who's a member of the Nature Economy team here at UNEP-WCMC, where her experience is in strengthening the role of biodiversity-based evidence in private sector decision-making. And she's been leading on the work of the scoping study, which we're presenting today. And also to introduce Julia Oliver, who's a trained lawyer with internationally recognised expertise on legal and policy issues linked to biodiversity, including with many years of experience working on access and benefit sharing. And Julia has provided invaluable guidance and input throughout the development of the scoping study as a partner and indeed alumni of UNEP-WCMC. And we're also joined for our discussion session later on by Daniela Guerras, who's our Senior Technical Specialist on International Policy and Conventions here at UNEP-WCMC and leading our engagement in the CBD processes. So with that, let me pass across to Amy to start our presentation of the findings. Amy, over to you.
Thank you, Neville, and hello, everyone. Welcome. So as noted in those opening remarks, there is a need for the multilateral mechanism to be designed and implemented in such a way that it considers and can address technological developments that might happen in the near and the far future. Next slide, please, Kirsty. Thank you. So the aims of this scoping study are to provide some initial insights from experts and practitioners on the future trends in the use of DSI by technologies that are known to rely on and value DSI in the form of commercial products and services. And by exploring some of the implications of these trends, we also wanted to identify potential areas for further research and discussion as well. Next slide, please. So this scoping study is not a comprehensive review, but it does provide and identify some preliminary trends that might be useful and interesting for the ongoing discussions on DSI. We've focused on technologies that use DSI for developing and manufacturing commercial products and services. We've looked at how these technologies are expected to evolve over time, and also what the implications might be for innovation in those products and services. And the reason that we focus on the different types of technologies rather than specific economic sectors is that there's actually quite a lot of overlap in the technologies that use DSI. In addition, innovation tends to occur at the technology development stage. So that's within research institutions or startup enterprises rather than within the companies that use these technologies to make finished products. So we identified 5 key clusters of technology to focus on. The preliminary selection of these was informed by a literature review and a survey, but I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. So the 5 key clusters of technology that we looked at are industrial biotechnology, medical biotechnology, agricultural biotechnology, DNA barcoding, and finally synthetic biology. So you'll note that DSI is central to all of these technologies, and it's used widely across different sectors and across different steps of our product's value chain as well. But it's also worth noting here that this is not an exhaustive list of technologies that use DSI. It's also somewhat artificial to try and separate technologies into distinct clusters because there's a lot of overlap in the techniques and principles between them. But for the purposes of this scoping study, it was useful to separate them out in this way to provide an initial mapping of trends and opportunities. Next slide, please. So to gather information on the future trends, we conducted a survey of experts and practitioners on technologies that use DSI commercially. We sent a survey out to over 270 people from academia, business, governments, and also the informal advisory group on benefit sharing from the use of DSI. And this survey contained questions relating to what companies and countries use and develop technologies on DSI. We also asked people about what innovations and new products and services they envisaged for the future. This survey was then supported by a high-level rapid review of the scientific literature, and this focused on recent literature available in the English language. So it provided a broad overview rather than an exhaustive analysis. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a breakdown of the survey respondents. So in total, we received 48 responses from 35 different institutions. And all 48 responses were considered in the analysis undertaken for the scoping study. And if you look at these 2 diagrams to the left, you can see that of those 48 people who responded, 42% came from a developing country, and the majority of responses came from Western Europe and other states, followed by Africa, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean, and then with a small percentage coming from Asia and the Pacific. Then if we look at the diagram on the right, we can also break this information down by the different institutions that were represented within this. So of those 35 institutions, 51% of those were based in developing countries. So I'm going to hand over to Julia now, who's going to go through the key findings of this survey and the literature review.
Thank you so much, Amy, and hello, everybody. So pleased to be with you today and also to have been able to collaborate with the fantastic team at UNEP-WCMC on this scoping study. I want to highlight some of the points that, Chris, if you could go to the next slide, please. The points that Amy made in terms of the focus on technologies. For those of you that have been working on access and benefit sharing for a while, you know that it was really the development of technologies that since the adoption of the CBD has been driving the changes in users, utilizations, the types of materials and information that are used in the utilization of genetic resources. So it has proved really fundamental to look at technological development to understand where the gaps and needs to adapt existing frameworks might be. So I think that highlights the importance of focusing on technologies. And also, I guess it's important to clarify that there are, of course, a number of different technologies and areas of technologies that are relevant for DSI. You have the technologies that are gathering the data from the physical environment, the technologies that are used to store the data, the technologies that are used to review the data, and we'll hear more on, for instance, the role of artificial intelligence from Amy later in the presentation. The focus of this scoping study has been on the technologies that actually apply DSI for the development of inputs into products. And we felt that this was an important area, and picking up from the information gathered through the survey in terms of identifying these future trends. Now, before I go into the actual specific findings on each technology, I should clarify I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, I'm a lawyer. So my expertise is not on these technologies themselves, but in the way that these technologies are addressed through law and policy. But this is why we really appreciate the input that we had from so many participants in the survey, and of course from all of you today. We appreciate your comments. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So among these 5 clusters, which as Amy mentioned, they are not, clearly distinct from each other, but they do illustrate the different trends. We have first industrial biotechnology. And industrial biotechnology is also called white biotechnology, and it basically involves the application of biological systems to industrial processes. So you are using, surely, products from industrial biotechnology now. For instance, a lot of the detergents that can wash clothes in low temperatures involve enzymes that have been developed from industrial biotechnology. Another very famous case of a product developed through industrial biotechnology are the stonewash jeans that came from an enzyme developed from a soda lake in Kenya. So just to give you some concrete examples of existing products from industrial biotechnology, in terms of future trends and specifically on the use of DSI, one of the things that information gathered pointed to was a more systematic search for microorganisms that could provide specific inputs and ingredients for industrial processes. So this was opportunistic to date and now becoming much more systematized. Another key area for industrial biotechnology will be looking at environmental benefits. So industrial biotechnology will be using DSI to, for instance, turn waste into valuable ingredients and inputs, and it will also be, for instance, generating bioplastics with improved biodegradability, for example. Next slide, please. The second cluster of technologies is medical biotechnology. It's also called red biotechnology, that's the color. And here we're talking about the development of pharmaceutical products, diagnostic products, and of course, drug development. Here it's worth highlighting that a lot of the trends in terms of medical biotechnology will involve human genetic resources, right? So we mentioned here, for instance, the move towards personalized medicine that will be fundamental in the coming years. However, when we look at non-human genetic resources, which are, of course, the relevant genetic resources in the context of the CBD, we're mostly looking at a drug discovery process that will be incredibly accelerated by the use of DSI. And this will mean that there's a lot more information from the natural world that will now be able to be captured through the data that already exists, but also, and this will link to the other group of technologies that we'll talk about, synthetic biology, nature-inspired drugs that actually may mimic but go beyond what already exists in nature. Please, next slide, please. The third group of technologies that we looked at, agricultural biotechnology, also called green biotechnology. Here is where we have new varieties of crops, for example, that provide higher yields, that provide increased resilience or enhanced nutrition. Again, here, when we look forward, we see a process that will be significantly accelerated by access to DSI. And also that will result not only then in new plant varieties, but increasingly in turning plants into real laboratories for the production of different substances. So here's also the link between agricultural biotechnology and, for instance, industrial biotechnology, because agricultural biotechnology is developing the plants that will generate the substances that are used in industrial biotechnology. Next slide, please. Great. So I hope I'm not sweeping through each of these technologies too quickly, but again, the point is really to leave time for discussion, and you will all have the study where these issues and trends are discussed in more detail. So DNA barcoding is a very interesting technology where a small short and standardized part of genetic material is used to identify species. And this, of course, has huge commercial and non-commercial applications. For instance, you can imagine taxonomy in terms of non-commercial applications. However, it is also already widely used for commercial purposes, namely, for instance, to identify the origin of certain foods. So, for instance, is this shrimp coming from Vietnam or elsewhere in the world? It's also used to ensure the quality of certain ingredients that companies are sourcing from around the world. So this is already important, already out there in the market. When we look at the future, we're really looking at DNA barcoding, both providing bigger insights, so really being used, for instance, to measure biodiversity and feed it into the emerging notion of biodiversity credits, but also smaller perspectives and being able to then look within that genetic material at the properties and dynamics of specific cell lines within an organism. So a lot of potential also for this technology. Next slide, please. And for the last cluster of technologies that we looked at, we have synthetic biology. Now, it's a real challenge to find one definition for synthetic biology. It's a very complex and evolving field. But the way I always like to think about it is the combination of science and engineering, right? Which is allowing scientists to design and redesign biological materials, even beyond what already exists in nature. This already exists. So, for instance, a lot of the plant-based meat substitutes that are available are developed through synthetic biology. We also can see that there is very interesting products such as glow-in-the-dark fish, right? These have also been developed through synthetic biology. However, beyond this novelty products, we will see very fundamental application of synthetic biology in the future, or so our experts are telling us. And this is because synthetic biology will allow the creation of things that exist in nature, the replication, but also the creation of what are called bionatives. So really organisms that do not exist in nature and could be used as drugs or as other types of ingredients in consumer products. So with that, Amy, I'll hand it back to you, but of course, I'm happy to expand on all of this during discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Next slide, please, Kirsty. Okay. Other trends. So I wasn't sure if you were going to cover this as well, Julia.
I'm happy to jump in. Basically, I think what we wanted to cover in this slide was the fact that there are areas of technology where we still are not sure to what the name of these technologies might be. So DSI is not only going to impact existing technologies, but also open up to entire new areas, such as this particular example of being used as an actual source of saving data and the possibility to really then, alter the way that we are managing all of the data that we use for various processes. So I think that's probably enough for this, Amy, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Julia. Yes, so as we know, the discussions on DSI and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits resulting from its use, it has covered a range of issues, including governance of databases that make DSI available. And as Julia was explaining over those slides, over the next few decades, technologies that rely and use DSI will revolutionize a range of economic sectors. And it is expected that DSI will continue to be a major foundation of biotechnology research and development across the globe. So lowered costs, technological advances, the acceleration of AI, these are all contributing towards DSI as a growing tool for commercial product development. This will open up possibilities for entirely new solutions that will potentially transform healthcare, agriculture, industry, and the environment. And one of the most transformative potentials of DSI could be the ability to enable broader and more rapid access to data, technologies, and products. And although the direction is moving towards more data being available, cheaper and easier to use technologies, a wider range of products, what I'd like to explore with you now over these next few slides is how the potential benefits of these innovations won't necessarily equate to increased accessibility across countries, or that there will be a fair and equitable sharing of the benefits. Next slide, please. So an important principle in DSI discussions has been the importance and availability of free-to-use DSI and DSI-derived data. And already there are huge quantities of free-to-use DSI stored within public databases, and this is set to become larger. So potentially this could provide new and additional opportunities for researchers around the world, which would have access to data and information at no cost. But it is important to consider here that the availability of DSI around the world and wider engagement with citizen science, analysis and dissemination, it won't necessarily translate into more inclusive, representative research or product development, for example. In addition to this, there will always be a component of proprietary data that's owned and restricted by private entities. So organizations and companies are already striving and racing to collect, analyze, and capitalize on genetic information in a kind of race for data. And so far, this type of practice, it has driven rapid advancements in commercial use of DSI and technologies. But if this approach continues, is it possible that this will create further barriers to innovation and equity, as only those who can afford to will be able to access and benefit from DSI data? Next slide, please. So another important aspect of data to consider is the impact of artificial intelligence and synthetic biology. So as we saw in those slides, advances in these technologies mean that research will no longer be limited to the genetic material found in nature. And this means that the creation of novel synthetic DSI will expand the products that we can produce with wide-ranging and potentially unlimited possibilities. And this becomes a really important dimension to be considered for the development of the multilateral mechanism. An example would be that ASI, artificial intelligence, consumes vast databases of DSI to train its models. The value of DSI, therefore, may lie in the dataset as a whole. And so there's a need to consider how the value of any one piece of DSI might change in response to databases becoming larger and larger over time. In addition to that, training AI models involves several rounds of learning. So for any finished product or service, it would be almost impossible to determine the contribution that any one particular piece of DSI had. So some experts actually believe that we will decreasingly rely on DSI from naturally occurring genetic resources to solve a problem or meet a demand. And so an important question to discuss will be how a product based entirely or partially on synthetic DSI would fit within a potential benefit sharing mechanism, and how would it be determined if a DNA sequence is naturally occurring or if it's the product of AI and synthetic biology. And I think it's worth noting here that some experts, they do acknowledge that AI technologies will still likely require DSI from real biological samples to train their models. And this is because we know there's a strong relationship between model performance and training data quality. So public databases of DSI, they've been instrumental to the progress achieved to date in biotechnology, but they may actually lack the size, quality, and diversity needed for future AI models to reach their full potential. So that's worth bearing in mind as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so another aspect to consider is, of course, access to technology and the products derived from them. So the trend is definitely towards technologies that use DSI becoming cheaper, more efficient. They'll be easier to use with fewer resources and little training. And a good example of this might be gene editing tools such as CRISPR. These have become increasingly lower barriers to entry, and they could empower people to harness biotechnology for their own use. And so an important discussion to have here relates to who will actually own and have access to these technologies in the future. Some experts are very concerned that rather than narrowing the technology gap between developed and developing countries, advances in technologies that use DSI could in fact widen this gap. We know at the moment that DSI underpins many of the technologies we've discussed, and it derives from developing countries. But the biotechnology companies that use this are concentrated in developed countries. So even if data is made open and technology is made accessible to many, we also need to consider which companies will be producing these products, where will these companies be located geographically, and if these products will be affordable and accessible to those in developing countries. And while it may be true that more and more research and investment is gradually focusing on developing regions, if technologies continue to be developed and patented by developed countries, then the issue of their access and use will of course have relevant implications for the multilateral mechanism. Next slide, please. So as you can see, there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding how and if these technologies that rely on DSI and the resulting products, how they will be accessible and reach countries fairly. And this uncertainty should be taken into account for a future-proof multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing in its modalities and its operationalization. And based on the recommendation that the working group prepared for consideration at COP16, the multilateral mechanism and its fund will operate according to the principles of inclusivity, equity, and transparency. So in light of these, it would be important that the elements and questions presented in this study inform what the applications of those principles would imply in practice. In addition, it may be decided that specific frameworks for sharing non-monetary benefits of specific sectors are developed, and when doing so, a wide range of aspects affecting access to and use of knowledge and technologies derived from DSI, some of which Julia and I have presented here, it would be very relevant. So as a final point, I'd like to share some directions for future research that we think could elaborate on DSI and the potential impacts of its use. So for example, the role of intellectual property rights and how these might limit access to technologies and products, as well as the benefits that may arise from their use, is very relevant to this conversation, I think. So finding that balance in future policies to incentivize innovation, whilst also promoting accessibility and equity, would benefit from further discussion. And this is especially critical given the significant public policy benefits that DSI-derived technologies can provide. Research could also look specifically, maybe at the role of private databases and how the different business models around these may or may not change in the future. Another important consideration is the impact of the use of DSI on major groups, such as Indigenous people and local communities, women and youths. And one of the limitations of this study is that we did not consult these groups, and so this is an area that requires attention to fully understand the impact of future potential use of DSI and the benefits arising from it. And so we hope that the findings of this scoping study will be useful in informing some of these discussions relating to the multilateral mechanism, so that it's set up and aligned with current and future developments of technologies that use DSI. But I think I'll stop there so that we can have plenty of time for discussion, because I'm really curious to hear what everyone thinks. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and I'll hand back over to you, Neville.
Brilliant. Thank you so much indeed, Amy and Julia, for that fabulous presentation of the draft scoping report. And I hope everyone's had a chance to find the draft scoping report through the links which were provided by Kirsty just before. So let's move on to a set of question and answer sessions. This might be an opportunity to ask questions of the presenters. It might be an opportunity to reflect on the findings, either from the presentation or from the report, which you've had a chance to look at before. I have to say, we are assuming a certain level of understanding around DSI. So thank you for the question, Matthew, about what does DSI stand for. I put a link in there to find out a bit of background information on DSI. Let's focus on this session on how we take forward the findings in the draft scoping report, and any gaps there might be. So, for example, we've had a great overview here of the different technologies which have been looked at in this draft scoping report around various industrial processes, linked to the health agenda, food security, knowledge management in terms of the storage architecture. We even mentioned glow-in-the-dark fish, and I can't imagine a world without glow-in-the-dark fish. So a number of different technologies that have been considered in the context of this scoping report. But is there anything key which is missing? Are there emerging technological advances of key relevance to DSI or that rely on DSI that we haven't covered in the scoping study? And if so, we'd be very keen to hear about those as a marker, particularly for future work. How do you see the development of technologies that use DSI impacting in your work, in your sector or area of expertise in the coming years? Very interested in more insight in how you see these trends moving into the future. And what do you see as the most transformative aspects of DSI technologies in your region or field of expertise? So that would be really interesting to pick up on. Certainly any reflections on the role of AI in driving change in the landscape for DSI-based products and services, and any key uncertainties it would be useful to share and air to take on board going forwards. I should say the intention off the back of discussions today is to update within the time available the draft scoping study and make it available as an information document to support discussions at COP16. So we welcome input which is very specific to the scoping study or more general comments, questions and views to be shared. So with that, we are open and we have a mixture of opportunities here by which you can raise a point. We have the Q&A function. Let me encourage people to use the Q&A function. Already we've got a number of questions coming through in there, which we'll pick up on. We'll do a mix of written responses, colleagues who've presented on the study, colleagues in the CBD Secretariat, and we're joined by CBD Secretariat colleagues also working on SynBio for this session as well. So we'll have a chance to respond to comments in the Q&A through written form. So for example, if you're requesting a link, then we can make sure we put that in the box for you. If there are questions, we can pick up on those and respond to them verbally. Let me just check if the chat box is being used as well. I think it probably is. So we have a combination of QAs, we have some chat box questions, and then if people want to raise their hand, we can also come to those as well. But let's start with the comment in the chat here, which has come in. We don't have the name in English, so apologies for that, but just cautioning around care in terminology. And thank you for that comment. That's hugely important. So just to make sure we are differentiating some of the different technologies at the play here, and sometimes the definitions are vague. And indeed, of course, we have to recognise that the definitions are quite vague for some of these terms. There are no agreed definitions, as we heard from Julia, including, of course, on DSI. So we are working with a range of working definitions. But I think the point you're making here, which is a really important one, is being very transparent about the scope of any particular definition that's implied by the terms that are being used. So that's a very helpful reminder in the chat box. Let's go to the Q&A box and see if there are some questions there which colleagues might want to pick up on. I'm looking at a spinning wheel as it loads at this end. So we have some different questions in here. I've responded, I think, to the DSI acronym question with a link through to some general background. There's a question here around DNA barcoding and SynBio. And from David, this question has come in. So maybe Julia or Amy might want to speak to this question here around why we've singled out DNA barcoding and SynBio in the list of biotechnologies, recognizing they are somewhat cross-cutting across industrial, medical, agricultural technologies as well. And this fabulous acronym CRISPR, which maybe Julia, you can explain to everyone as well. Thank you.
Thank you, and such useful points. Thank you, David, and others talking about terminology and how to approach this. To be honest, it was a very difficult and long discussion among authors, and we also went back and discussed with many of the experts that we consulted. Any division of technologies is arbitrary because the lines are blurred, and many of these technologies are used in different ways in different industries, and really in a synergetic manner. As Amy explained and I emphasized, we do realize that this is somewhat arbitrary, but I guess what would be key to hear from you is we chose these 5 groups of technologies, let's call them, as a way to illustrate different types of trends. And this is the key part, right? To get as much as possible with this scoping study, a view as to what is coming down the line in terms of technological developments. So I guess the question that would be useful for all of you to consider, and we'd love to hear back from you on, is, are there any should we, if we had approached a different technology or in a different way, might we get additional insights, right? So somebody was mentioning bioengineering, or of course, we could look at very specific technologies such as CRISPR-Cas, and that may, if any of you have suggestions about, do look here, because you might get some complementary or maybe opposing trends. I think that would be super interesting. Any kind of distinction is, of course, a little bit arbitrary. And if I may, Neville, just to also answer another of the questions I saw that was asking about the cosmetic industry and whether and why it wasn't mentioned. I want to highlight that we don't mention any specific industry as such, rather the technologies that feed into different industries. So for instance, industrial biotechnology is, of course, very relevant to cosmetics and personal care product. Of course, the update of these technologies in the different industrial sectors depends on cost and profit margins. And so we did hear from many of the companies working in this space that there are some sectors that are picking up these technologies more than others. Pharmaceutical being one sector where there is a lot of uptake of these technologies. So there's that distinction, but I want to highlight that we're not looking at industries or economic sectors. We're looking at technologies that are actually applied across the board. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Hula. And yeah, Helia, and yes, very cross-cutting, as you mentioned also in the presentation, across all of these different technologies. Just let me check whether a colleague from the CBD Secretariat wants to pick up on SynBio specifically, whether Wadsley wanted to say a few words on the link between SynBio and DSI. It was part of the presentation, but anything additional to add, Wadsley, on that?
Thank you, and good morning. I was just going to add a link to Technical Series 100, where a number of these technologies are picked up. And there you will be able to see that there are applications of technologies, and there are the actual technologies themselves. So DSI is one of the elements that is a key component of the synthetic biology value chain. And a number of the findings in the study are also reflected in the work that has been done on horizon scanning on synthetic biology. So you'll be able to also see, I will also put a link to the horizon scanning study for synthetic biology, where a number of these applications are also reflected. Thanks.
That would be super helpful. Thank you so much, Wati, and you put that in the chat box. Just picking up on Anna's comment in the Q&A here as well around the direct link to the scoping document. So the scoping document is available from a link in the registration page. So when you've registered for this webinar, as you've all done to access it, then in there is the link to the document. If you can't find that at the moment, don't worry, because in the coming days, I won't promise a particular day, but in the coming days, the document will be available as an InfDoc for COP16. So you'll be able to pick up on it fully at that stage as well. Okay, let's look at some of these other comments that have come in here, mentioning that most DSI originates from developing countries. Well, there's certainly in the presentation, Amy mentioned that the respondents we had came variously. She presented the geographic breakdown of respondents to the survey that was sent out, which was a component of the insight from the scoping report, and a slight majority of those, I think 51% of the institutions were based in developing countries. I don't recall the specific comment from Kirsty around this, but there may have been something missing there. And then a question from Romy here around DSI in the finance sector. So again, as Julia mentioned, this wasn't sector-based, it was more technology-based. And there may be more we could think about in the context of how those technologies are applied in the finance sector. And certainly on the issue of storage architecture, one could imagine, which was an example given in the other possible technologies, one can imagine all sorts of potential applications there as well. But let me check whether Julio or anyone else wants to pick up on the point from Romy around DSI in the finance sector and the extent to which that was considered so far, or otherwise might be something we come back to, including with support from UNEP Finance Initiative and others. Julio.
Yeah, Romy, we'd love to work with you on this. So absolutely. But I think, as Neville mentioned, we didn't look at particular sectors. But something that I might add is that talking to the different companies in this space, so the companies using these technologies, it's very interesting to talk about the different access to financing that they have had and investments and venture capitals. And this is, of course, also very determinant for where technology is going and the accessibility to technology and derived products. So I do think it's a very relevant question to ask. And yeah, certainly an area for future collaboration. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julia. And let me look at some of the other questions here. We have here from Jens Sundstrom, relevant to look at the importance of DSI for biodiversity. Yes, good question. So we heard, of course, already around DNA barcoding and the importance of that for monitoring, and we're seeing a rapid uptake in DNA barcoding based technologies for monitoring biodiversity around the world, which will be an important component of that. Of course, the multilateral mechanism that has been agreed, we anticipate will lead to significant additional funding, of course, for biodiversity as well, through the funding mechanism to be agreed and operationalized, rather, through COP16. But any additional thoughts from colleagues on DSI for biodiversity itself? From colleagues. Julia, you popped off again.
Yeah, so I don't want to be the only one talking here. So Amy, please go ahead if you have thoughts on this, and would also love to hear other people from also participants share your thoughts. I would say it's absolutely a very important area, not the focus of this particular scoping study, but Jens, indeed, when looking at this, we kept coming to the importance for conservation and the application for non-commercial uses around different conservation technologies. But Amy, please do say more.
Yes, I think I was probably just going to say the same things, that, there's lots of potential to offer opportunities for biodiversity protection, like you were saying, through real-time environmental monitoring using DNA barcoding, developing sustainable alternatives to resource-intensive products. But of course, with any new technologies, they come with opportunities and risks. So we need to make sure there's strong governance frameworks to ensure that the use of these technologies support rather than undermine biodiversity conservation goals.
Great, thank you, Amy. Question here as well on why we've looked at technologies, and some of these aren't particularly new. I think that's a valid point. But the point about these technologies is they're all subject at the moment to very rapid advances, particularly in relation to their application in relation to DSI. So their use of DSI or their relationship to DSI is particularly important. But you are saying here, and I can't find the name because it's hidden behind a little button I've got here, not renew, but wouldn't it be more important to look into how the generation, storage and use of DSI has changed and may change in the future? And of course, these are interrelated, right? Because we did mention about the database issue discussion, but we've focused in this scoping report very much on the commercial use of DSI and the technologies which are being advanced very rapidly to try and give a little bit of a sense of the direction that's being taken into the future for the commercial use of DSI. But again, any thoughts on this one, Julia? The question here that's come in from.
Yeah, just to also refer back to the wise words of the co-chair at the beginning of the webinar, talking about a puzzle, right? And I think this is the real challenge and interest and importance of these discussions, is that there are all of these elements that come together. And as in any puzzle, it's almost impossible to talk about one piece without noting the edges that connect it to everything else. So absolutely, I think there's a lot of, and the issue of, which of course was mentioned by Amy in the considerations, the issue of access to data and data storage. And this is also something that came from a number of the experts that we talked to, the fact that there's also interesting trends in who is gathering the data, who holds it, who shares it with whom. So that's also an area of a lot of movement that it's definitely worth looking into. Again, our scoping study is a little piece in this bigger puzzle, but hopefully with your input today, which we'll actually take into account, we can contribute something to the discussion.
Thank you, Julia. Let's pick up on this comment from Daniel as well. Very important point here. Of course, a huge amount of discussion going on under the CBD on DSI, but also discussions in other bodies in fora, including the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, including on the World Health Organization, including in the High Seas Treaty, BBNJ discussions as well on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And the question is whether or not any of the responses were explicit about DSI from marine genetic resources from areas beyond national jurisdiction, and whether that was a component of the responses we received, or indeed the literature which we assessed as well.
This is one of, oh, sorry, go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, so just to say that for the survey, we didn't receive responses specifically on this issue, although it's a very important and complex topic, DSI from areas beyond national jurisdiction. Our scoping study focused specifically on technologies and trends related to DSI, so we didn't delve deeply into jurisdictional topics such as areas beyond national jurisdiction or the high seas, but it's definitely a really important question: who should benefit from DSI originating in these areas? And so it's something that needs to be addressed, I guess, in the discussions and the process to ensure that DSI from these areas is shared in a way that promotes equity, sustainability, and benefit sharing. But Julia, maybe you can say something more specific on that.
Maybe just to complement Amy, the fact that it's certainly one of the areas, marine biotechnology is we could have been an additional area. It's focused not on the type of technology, but on the type of resource. But it's one of the fastest growing areas and a lot of interest in the potential commercial use of organisms and substances coming from the sea. So I believe to date, most of the commercial potential comes from areas around the coast. However, we do know, and there have been studies of ongoing bioprospecting happening in the high seas, and that of course would translate into data and potential commercial applications. So I think definitely something to consider. And then the governance aspect, as Amy mentioned, becomes an important question.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, and for that important point as well, Daniel. Okay, we have some other comments here and questions coming through. So the application of, or the impact of DSI on how our economic systems work, including in relation to natural capital accounting. And we mentioned some of this in the context of the presentation, again, going back to the DNA barcoding, enabling understanding of natural capital accounts linked to the presence of biodiversity, but there may be broader considerations there. It wasn't a part of the scoping study specifically, but as with the finance sector, an opportunity to think about how these technologies might be deployed in relation to understanding, and of course, each of these technologies are major contributors to the economy. So important parts of the economy being driven through these technologies. So that will be an important consideration as well. But then we have another question up here, which is in relation to, where's it gone? Here, cosmetic sector. And Julia, do you want to elaborate a little bit? Because that was a part of it. Again, it links across to different types of technologies. And the point is that the scoping study looked at technologies rather than sectors, but they relate to various of the technologies considered. So Julia, do you want to pick up on the cosmetics sector question?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, as I mentioned, yes, and as you're saying, Neville, the focus was not on sectors, but the cosmetic and personal care sector is definitely one of the sectors using these technologies. And we see above all the use of white technology. So you replacing, the sources, the feed, let's say, for some of the commodities that are used in cosmetics to replace them for less environmentally damaging crops or input. We also see active ingredients being developed through biotechnology and being grown in reactors or tanks. This is, as you know, and are not still the mainstream of the cosmetic sector, but certainly an area where the use of DSI is important. But yeah, there's different uptake in the different sectors. So this is one of the relevant sectors, I would say, but there are, of course, many others. And I think the focus on the technologies proves, and also talking to the companies working in these technological sectors, that they are talking to potential clients across the board, from building companies to food companies, and everybody's interested in figuring out what these technologies can do for them. And I think the potential is right now very, very high, which makes it very important that we have this conversation and that we try to define what are the ways in which we can support the development of this mechanism to be sufficiently, of course, predictable, but at the same time flexible, to adapt to these changing technologies.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julia. I've moved to the chat function because we have some more comments here as well. So thank you for the chat comment from Juliana. I believe we're missing an element in this discussion on traditional knowledge associated to biotechnology progress and development. How DSI multilateral mechanism is taking into consideration indigenous people, local communities, consultation, consent and benefit sharing. Of course, this is a key part of the negotiations in relation to the engagement with traditional knowledge and indeed the financial mechanism and funding disbursement as well. But in relation to the consultation and consent on DSI itself, this is something which we do mention. Julia, do you want to say a couple of words on that?
I would like to be terribly bold and invite Danny to participate in this discussion because, of course, Danny's done a lot of work on the issue of access and benefit sharing. And Danny, I'm happy to complement it, but I think any of your thoughts on prior informed consent and what it still means and how this might be considered in the multilateral mechanism, I, for one, would be very happy to hear them.
Great, thanks, Julia. So Danny, or whether Charlotte or Kirsty want to say reflections on this one as well? And indeed, whether the co-chairs would like to reflect on the status of negotiations.
Yes, maybe the only thing I will mention briefly, thank you so much, Julia and Amy, for the excellent presentation, is that we have not covered, as Amy was explaining, in terms of the scoping study has a narrow scope that we try to clarify in the document, and a lot of very important topics like the role of traditional knowledge that is related to genetic resources or the technologies that use it is not something that we have looked into detail, but definitely it's an area that is very relevant to the discussions and has been a really important pillar of the conversations around access and benefit sharing in the CBD, and therefore important to consider going forward. But in terms of the multilateral mechanism, I think if the co-chairs would be able to share some thoughts, that might be very helpful for the participants. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. And Will's camera's come on, so let's turn to Will on this topic, but also on the question that's come in as well, and the point that's come in from Brendan on research organisations' access to DSI. So just to elaborate a bit on the distinction, this study, of course, focused on the commercial use of DSI and technologies relating to commercial use of DSI. But within the negotiations, Will, tell us a bit more about the engagement with Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge and consent, and also on the distinction between the commercial use and research agenda.
Huge thanks, Neville and everyone. So, and perhaps some others might want to come in too. But I mean, we've benefited from the really deep engagement of IPLC, leaders and voices and negotiators as well throughout our process. It's been brilliant since actually since before COP15. To have had that incredibly important perspective, not least because, as the questioner absolutely sort of puts, gets absolutely right, IPLCs parties are rights holders, and indeed, retain incredibly important associated traditional knowledge that is often linked to DSI. So we've worked very closely, with IPLCs through both the formal negotiations and the informal advisory group. We've discussed associated traditional knowledge and other sort of related biocultural metadata several times. There are provisions in our draft decision for specific ways of dealing with that important information and dealing with the important question. We probably won't want to get too into the details of it right now, other than to say that it's a really, really live and important part of our negotiations. And I imagine that the draft decision will contain some quite specific provisions on those things. What was the second question you asked me to look at?
It was
Neville?
on
I'm so sorry.
It's again live part of negotiations, but just to elaborate slightly on the distinction between consideration of commercial use and the research agenda.
Very good indeed. So another live question, absolutely. That I think, parties take different positions, and so I don't want to, characterize too generally. What I would say is that over the course of the years that we've been running this process, I think there is a broad acceptance that it's those who are financially benefiting from the use of digital sequence information who should be sharing financial benefits from the use of digital sequence information, if that makes sense. So if, for example, you are a researcher and you are not generating a financial benefit, you wouldn't be expected under the multilateral mechanism to be sharing a financial benefit. At the same time, there is also a recognition that benefits arising from the use of digital sequence information could be non-monetary benefits. So as a researcher, for instance, you are generating a research product, you're generating information or knowledge, and there is an ask coming through in the negotiations that the researcher in question find a way to share that non-monetary benefit, that knowledge, that information. And like I say, that is a live issue of negotiation, but that feels to me like the prevailing direction of travel. Thanks, Neville.
Very useful. Thank you very much indeed, Will. That's fantastic. Charlotte, let me check. Do you want to come in at this stage with any reflections on the comments, questions raised so far?
Sure. Thank you, Neville. Sorry, the only point I really wanted to make was that, as Will was saying, associated traditional knowledge, role, rights, and interests of Indigenous people and local communities are actively being discussed, and it's really something that the way we see it should be decided for the present use of DSI, and the scope of this study was really on the future uses of DSI. So until we have a decision on how to manage those things for the present use of DSI, there's really no telling if we'll need something different or separate for future uses of DSI in the future. So that was my point in terms of the scope of this study. We might not need a separate solution for this than what we're currently discussing. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Charlotte. That's very useful clarification. Thank you as well, Melissa, Curtis, for your comment in here around using DSI to assist in environmental assessment, water quality, and so on. I think that's an important part of the technology, the application of the technologies. Maybe it links as well to the comment from Sarah Kreitz as well. Thank you for that. Using DNA barcoding around traceability, around sourcing, for example, on genetic integrity, identity, and origin, and detecting fraudulent sourcing claims. So a very useful application of DSI technologies, again, linked through to the DNA barcoding technology, which was mentioned in the scoping study as well. Good. Okay, I'm scanning the chat box. We have, I think, another question coming in the Q&A box. Let me continue to encourage any further thoughts, questions that people may have, or reflections. Let me find where the latest Q&A is. No, that's not there. And you click that button. Jens has picked up on the non-monetary benefit sharing, and this again is a key part of the negotiations. Maybe we can put a link into the chat box as well to the document which is going into COP16 for negotiation, which lays out the state of the negotiations in terms of the scope of what's been discussed so far, the extent of the square brackets around the text, so that's pretty much all of it, where there's remaining negotiation to determine the operationalization of what's already been agreed at COP15 to be a multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing. So the question around non-monetary benefits is live in the negotiations, and there's more of that in the negotiation document, and we can put a link in the chat box to that directly. And then thank you. We've got more questions here. Marco, how is a financial benefit from the use of DSI defined? Again, this is subject to ongoing negotiations. Does Charlotte or Will or Fatso want to speak to the options on the table for how one might define a financial benefit? And this is again why we focused on this scoping report in the future commercial use technologies, recognizing that they are by definition those which are going to lead to financial benefits. But let me see if any colleagues want to pick up on the question around the scope of consideration for determining financial benefits from the use of DSI. Will?
Yeah, of course. And if others want to come in, please do. So, but simply because it's a live topic of negotiation, and so lots of people will have slightly different views, and that's the right way that our process should work. There's been, I think, a long process since COP15 looking at various ways of calculating the kinds of financial benefits that derive from the use of DSI, how they derive from the use of DSI, and of course, how many benefits, right? I mean, that's one of the big questions, isn't it? Is how big are these financial benefits and who are they accruing to? And there's been a process of looking at various sort of policy options that's been informed by the work of an informal advisory group of experts and also some studies that have been commissioned by the CBD Secretariat. That was all sort of fed into a meeting that took place in Montreal a couple of weeks ago, and a few options have emerged there from that meeting. And effectively, I think, and I'm looking at some of the other questions as well, Neville, in the chat that are asking about sort of the linkage between specific uses of specific bits of DSI and specific financial outputs. And I think what the global community has recognized is that that's technically very, very difficult, that actually trying to make that kind of linkage between one bit of DSI or even a million bits of DSI, because obviously researchers are often using huge amounts of data, trying to make that link and that flow is very, very difficult. And so actually what negotiators around the world have started to agree on is something that feels a little bit more like proxies, if you like, a little bit more like sort of aggregates and ways of imagining the value of DSI. One of the options on the table at the moment is to peg effectively the financial benefits that derive from the use of DSI to simply the overall size of the company. So if you are a company that operates in a sector that is reliant on DSI, so we've had a long conversation about sectors already, a proportion of that company's revenue or turnover or profit or sales, lots of different negotiating square brackets, a proportion of that revenue might be put into the global fund, for instance, or shared financially. And there's other options as well that relate to products and services. But I think in principle, the conversation's moved from a very specific use of one bit of DSI to generating a specific dollar number, and a conversation that actually says a little more generally, okay, these sectors are reliant on DSI, or these products obviously use DSI. Let's look at how much money is made there, and let's put some of that money somewhere else. Like I say, that's a global negotiation. I'm trying to summarize the lots of diverse views from lots of different people. I hope that's about right. Thank you.
Very useful, thank you, Will. And again, a reminder, negotiations will continue, of course, at COP16 itself. But I think, Jan, you sum it up quite nicely here around the infeasibility of tracking individual DSI contributions to a product. And this is highlighted in the report, where it's not just pieces of digital sequencing information in the tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, but billions of pieces of information contributing through, and particularly in the context of AI technologies. So thank you for that comment in there. It is going to be impossible to attribute pieces of DSI to product outcomes in the future, and that's well recognized. Thank you as well, for Danielle mentioning the Responsible Research and Innovation Framework. I don't know if we've looked at that already, but we can certainly pick up on that and see where that would be relevant for this work going forwards. And we've got a comment here from Jutta around differentiating commercial from research. Again, as Will mentioned, this is ongoing discussion, the extent to which that will have implications. Clarity will be needed, of course, in due course, and many commercial institutions undertake research for commercial applications. So there's going to be some thought needed to that. And you've elaborated on a couple of examples of where that would be the case, including with the experiences in the copyright in the publication sector as well. So that's very useful observation to pick up on there as well. Let me scan back, and thank you, Kirsty, for putting the link in the chat box there. If you've not seen that, please do take a look on the recommendation that came from the group chaired by Will and Fatso, the open-ended working group on benefit sharing from the use of DSI, at its latest meeting in August, which is the basis for negotiations in COP16. So all the details of the state of the negotiations, the options available, and as I mentioned, what has and hasn't mainly been agreed is included in that document. So do please take a look. And if you're not used to negotiating text, and if you see a square bracket around some words or a paragraph or a section, it's not yet been agreed. So thank you for that. Let's go back to the Q&A function and see if there's anything else here which we might want to pick up on, or if you feel you've not yet had your comment considered or addressed, then please do flag it, possibly even by raising your hand and talking to it. But we'll continue to scan what's coming in the chat box and the Q&A function as well. And colleagues, if there's anything you can recognise there that needs to be picked up on, then please do flag it as well. I think we've dealt with this one on non-monetary benefits. A number of these questions relate to the point that Will made about the challenge of traceability, and therefore the mechanism seeming to move in a direction of not needing to have that direct traceability in order to share the benefits from DSI, but looking more at companies and sectors where there is a important commercial use. And then many questions still on how the fund would operate, of course, to receive those funds, what the basis of that would be, and then still questions, of course, on how the fund would disperse funds back to provide benefits for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. More information on that also in the document that Kirsty's posted the link to in the chat. Implications for the differences between genetic resources and digital sequencing information for product development. I think the answer to that is less and less so, but obviously more important is the growth in the use of DSI rather than materials being extracted, as Julia mentioned earlier. That's the trend, and these technologies, all of which are included in the scoping report, have been included because they are areas in which the trend is very much for the greater use of DSI and less for genetic resources taken directly from the natural world. So thank you for that. And we have a point just come in now from Keiko. Scoping study reported figures for corporate sector profits, took into account the success and failure rates of businesses during the survey. Of course, companies recover their losses through profits where they have been successful. So let me turn to Amy, Danny or Julia to see whether or not there was any consideration given to the fact that many research, including for commercial, does not lead to profit making. Did that come through in our survey?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Neville. And yeah, maybe just on this, again, not the focus of the scoping study, but if I may just speak to conversations that we had in the research leading to the scoping study and other discussions. I think there's two questions that are coming from the private sector. One is, which I think also came up here in the chat, is can you say that a technology is very relevant to an entire sector, or is it relevant to some of the companies in the sector, which goes very much to what Will was saying is one of the potential approaches for sharing benefits. And I think there's the perception that these technologies are still used in certain cases rather than widespread, and the sense that talking about an entire sector might not be appropriate. Again, this is a perspective of some of the companies we talked to. And then the other is very much, Neville, as you're saying, the risks and investments and failure rates around many of these products. So I think this also is something worth looking at on a sector per sector perspective, because of course the R&D timelines and investments are very different if we're talking about pharmaceutical, personal care, food. So they're also, the implications of one failed product are very different, right? So if you're looking at drug development, it will take, at least 10 years to develop a new product, whereas in the food sector, it would be much faster, right? So I think these are all considerations that I think are also being brought in through different studies and discussions to the DSI negotiations, but all relevant points, surely. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. And I guess by definition, if a company is not succeeding in commercial applications, then it doesn't exist for too much longer anyway. So that's a consideration too. Val, huge apologies, and thank you for reminding me that I had missed your point earlier around elaborating on the subject of bio-natives, and thank you for the reminder on that. Apologies, and thank you for your patience. Amy, do you want to speak to Val's request to elaborate on the subject of bio-natives?
Sure. So when we say bio-natives, we mean genetic resources that are novel and synthetic, so they don't exist in nature. So they're these completely novel genetic resources.
Okay, great. So hopefully that clarifies, Val, on that point, and thank you very much for that, and apologies. Anything to add to that, Julia?
Yeah, maybe just to say this is, of course, very important, given that they are in some cases impossible to distinguish from the real thing. So they don't come from nature, but they are impossible to distinguish, which raises all kinds of questions in terms of impacts on the market, on consumers, on regulatory control. So that's why it's a particularly interesting concept and still very much emerging.
Great, thank you very much. And of course, a technology that's not unique to DSI. We're seeing that across the, whether you're looking at your social media feed or wondering whether the video is real or not, that same concept applying across various technologies. So thank you for that. And thank you again for the patience, Val, on that. Good. So I don't see any additional points. Let me just quickly check in the chat box as well. We are coming towards the end of our time on the webinar, but let me just pause for a moment to see if there are any remaining key questions which are coming through. And Maria Jose has just posted in here around intellectual property rights. I don't think this is an issue we consider specifically in the scoping report, but any reflections on intellectual property rights in the context of the wider DSI discussion from either colleagues at UNEP-WCMC or colleagues at the CBD Secretariat or the co-chairs. Daniela, do you want to speak to that?
Maybe very briefly, because obviously we captured it as a dimension to be considered in furthering the thinking around this topic, because obviously when thinking about technology and access to technology and sharing technology, that obviously is a really important aspect of anything that has to do with thinking about also non-monetary benefits. It's quite important to consider what implications intellectual property rights may have, both in the context of as a source for incentivizing innovation, that is what Amy was presenting during the presentation, but also around, okay, what effects they may have in not allowing or enabling access in a fair and equitable manner, thinking around technologies, knowledge, and so on. So definitely we didn't go into detail. We just decided that it was maybe more appropriate to include this reference as part of the consideration and potential implications, because obviously as the multilateral mechanism becomes operational and the work on DSI advances, it's certainly an important dimension to consider. And there has been obviously a significant amount of work on this topic around genetic resources and also traditional knowledge. So there is a lot to work on that still. Thank you so much.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you, Maria Jose, for raising that point as well. So with that, let me thank everyone hugely for joining us for this webinar and your very insightful questions, comments, reflections and thoughts. And we'll pick up on many of these in the chat we have already in the Q&A as we look to finalise this draft scoping report as an information document for COP in the coming days. So huge thanks to all of you for that. There is clearly much more to be both thought about, considered, worked on and kept under review as we take forward the multilateral mechanism on DSI. These technologies are expanding at an extremely rapid pace. And the one thing we can be sure of in terms of technological progress is it's always going to be much quicker than we think. And so we're going to need to keep these advances under review. Let me turn for some final reflections then back to our co-chairs for the working group on DSI. And I believe Mfatso may say a few words to close us out from this session. Again, a huge thanks to all of our presenters, thanks to the colleagues at the CBD Secretariat for organising, convening with us the webinar, and a reminder that if you're not already, then you can register now for the 2 other sessions on DSI coming up next week, and the link for that is in the chat. Maybe we can put it in the chat again for people who have joined after that was posted, so they have access to that. And then we will also make sure that the recording for this session is posted, and we'll make sure there's a link to that as well from maybe that same web page, I guess, but the colleagues in the Secretariat can confirm that as well. But with that, let me thank you all again and pass across back to our co-chairs, and I think Mfatso is with us, otherwise back to Will.
Yeah, I'm here and have been listening very attentively to this valuable conversation and a very productive session, I must say. It's highly valuable, and as we are trying to find ways and consider options for the operationalization of the multilateral mechanism, I think this is timely, and we'll continue, like you indicated, to have these important webinars moving ahead so that we continue to consider the options that are available for us in time for the upcoming COP. Yeah, so just to say a huge thank you to our wonderful presenters today, Amy, Julia, and we also had Daniela, and also a very special thank you to you, Nivel, for the chairing, as well as for leading us through that great session for the day. And as the team has indicated, they will be publishing the study soon. And so we do look forward to that and hope that this will form a helpful information document for the future work that is ahead of us. I think anything we can get at this moment to help the process is greatly, greatly valuable. And there isn't too much for me to reflect based on that fruitful discussion. I think we had quite a good question and answer exchange, which has also opened up to some of the issues that have been reflected upon. And just to remind, just like you have said, Niviu, that we are continuing these webinars. And on 1st October, we are having another one also on a great topic that is part of the recommendations that came out of the Montreal meeting, where we're looking at the elements, potential elements for a formula for allocation of funds from the Global Fund, which is also an important topic. And we hope that we'll have as a good participation as we had today at that next meeting on 1st October. So see you soon, everyone. And thank you very much for making yourselves available. We hope to see you in the next upcoming webinar. Thank you very much, and bye from my side.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mfatso. Just to mention, we've got the link to where the recording will be in the chat box there. You have the technical series, you have the recommendation, you have the webinar registration for next week. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to joining you again next week for the second in these webinar series. Thanks so much. Bye-bye for now.